Hi, everyone. Welcome to our online webinar series called Support for Caregivers of Bereaved Children. Get my slides all going. So we'll just take a moment to introduce both of ourselves. My name is Orly Culverhouse, and I am the Caring Hearts Children's Program Coordinator at St. Joseph's Hospice, and I'm also the music therapist.
And my name is Kayla Sligers, and I am the Supportive Services Coordinator, and I oversee the Adult Bereavement Program and occasionally assist with the Children's Program.
So this is just an agenda of what we're hoping to cover today. We'll go over some housekeeping. Today is all about kind of grief 101. What are the basic things that we feel everybody should know about grief? There are a lot of myths out there about grief, so we're going to do some grief myth bustings. We'll talk about grieving styles, the effects of grief, different types of grief. And at the end of each webinar series, we are hoping to end with something we like to call teachable moments, which is just a way for you to apply what you've learned today and kind of put that into practice with your kids. We try to make things as practical as possible here. And so it's just ways to put what we've talked about today into practice. So housekeeping, and we'll kind of go over this at the beginning of every webinar. This is a 5-part series. This is number 1 in the 5-part series. Usually we would be running this group in person, physically at the hospice, and it's typically offered concurrently, which means at the same time as our children's group, which is ages either 6 to 9 or 10 to 13. So that parents or caregivers can drop their kids off in the kids program and then have a group of their own where they can learn about grief, kind of learn about what their kids are doing in their group, and then again, how to apply the things that we're learning outside of group. Right now, though, we are all working from home because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and we're all practicing physical distancing. So we thought this was a great opportunity to record these modules as a way to be able to provide some services while we're all physical distancing. But also we're hoping that this is going to be a great resource moving forward for busy caregivers, right? If you have multiple kids and you're not really able to, come and dedicate the time while your kid is in group to come to the parent or caregivers group, we're hoping that providing you with the exact same information that you would get in the physical regular group is going to be helpful to you. So this is all the same material that we would cover if this was an in-person group. The only thing that you're not really going to have is that kind of group experience and getting to meet with other caregivers. But hopefully, when we're all able to come back together again, we usually do something all together on the last day of group, which would be week 6, which is why we don't include it here. And then it would give you an opportunity to meet other caregivers who are in a similar situation as you. So that's the structure of the group. Like I said, we'll always end with those teachable moments. So we kind of start and end pretty much the same. If you have received this webinar series via email, so the link to this video, there's usually going to be some extra resources also attached to that email. So it might be handouts, it might be like special resources that we really like, just kind of like extra reading, extra material that you can kind of look through on your own. Sometimes we'll mention them in the webinar series, and other times we'll just send them on. If you are watching this video online, you've stumbled upon it on our YouTube channel, and you're interested in receiving copies of the slides or any of the material, please feel free to send us an email. And the email for supportive services at sjhospice.ca is on the slide. Also, if you have any feedback or questions, concerns, anything like that, you can always reach out to us. We are happy to continue this conversation. I mean, I think in a lot of ways, these are conversation starters, but we're always happy to discuss this with you.
Okay. So what is grief? So we just want to start a little bit by talking about kind of some grief 101, some definitions about grief. So to start, we want to share a video with you. This is a video from Rochelle McGuire. So it's a few minutes long. So tune in and we will continue our discussion right afterwards.
So I want to have have a shared understanding before I go any further about what is grief. What do I believe it to be? And one of the biggest mythologies I see that we have culturally in grief is that it's a feeling, right? So yes, absolutely, it manifests in our feelings, but grief itself is not a feeling. It actually is an experience, right? So one of the most useful ways that I can describe it is to compare it to the analogy of childbirth. So when somebody or a body is about to deliver a baby, the body is gripped by an energy. It's gripped by an experience that can often be experienced as painful, traumatic, disruptive. It is also an experience that is deeply unique to that body. So we hear a variety of birth stories. Some last 3-4 days. They're incredibly drawn out and long. Some 2 hours, in and out, it's done. Some have the pain of a hurricane. Some are really soft and lapping. It's a deeply unique experience, but one that requires a tremendous amount of strength and energy, and one that is all-consuming. So we don't often ask somebody when they're in the middle of childbirth to like go get groceries, right? Or we wouldn't say, I think you should get back to work. I think you just need another focus, right? Be like, have some understanding that what they're doing is pretty intense, needs their focus, right? And perhaps we should just be a supportive force in their life. And then we go over here to this other end of the spectrum with grief, and we suddenly start treating it really differently, right? We're very, very quick to pathologize it. And what we understand with birth is that ultimately there is something incredibly magical, mysterious, sacred, whatever your language is, that is going on. We also have an inherent trust as a community that it's ultimately something that only that body can do, right? We cannot birth a child for somebody else. We also don't want to leave them alone, right? Just because we can't do it for them doesn't mean we're like, see ya, good luck, let me know when the baby comes, right? We don't need to leave birthing people in rooms alone, right? It's a really intense and scary experience that requires support. And so we have an understanding that we step in, we do something that is so beautifully intrinsic to us in birth and not so much in grief, which is just to actually bear sacred witness, right? I am here, I will not abandon, I will stay present, bear witness to what you're experiencing. I will have deep and inherent trust in your ability to know what you need, to know what your body needs to do. And when and only when, if you invite me in, will I come forward, right? So if you have a need, I will meet the need. But otherwise, I'm just gonna stay back here and trust you and not abandon, right? Which is actually the exact same thing that is required over here at this end for folks who are grieving. But instead, we somehow get really bundled up and we say it's just a feeling. So have a few tears, particularly stereotypes of your female body, you get to have a few tears, not too many because then you're hysterical and we'll get you medicated, right? But a little bit, you give a few. Not too little, because if you don't have any tears, then you're stoic, right, and you're cold and you're unfeeling. That's worrisome. So I've yet to figure out what the formula is, but I think it's like 3 tears out of the right eye, 2 out of the left, and then folks seem to be comfortable. And if you're male body, the stereotypes, you get to be a little bit angry or a little bit withdrawn, right? And if that was all the experience of grief was, it would make sense that we would then have our next mythology, which is experience your feelings, and maybe in 6 to 12 months, you'll be over it. Right? That would make sense if the mythology is that grief is just a feeling. It is not, right? It is an entire experience that affects us on every single level of our being. So it affects our bodies, our physical bodies, our minds, our cognitive abilities, and our thoughts. It does affect us emotionally. And then the areas where we don't talk about a lot for some reason is that it absolutely affects us socially, right? How we engage with our peer group. It affects us sexually, our intimate lives, and it absolutely affects us spiritually. When I say spiritually, it may be faith-based, but I really mean our sense of security and safety, our worldview. So it affects us on every level of our being. So then what does it take to metabolize this well, right? If the fundamental rule, absolute rule of engagement across the board universally is that we are born and that we die, whatever your belief system is in terms of how we came to be here, whether we evolved, whether we were created, whatever it is, I cannot believe that we were put into these vessels and are not able to metabolize or sustain the pain that is required to bring life into the world and the pain that is required to see life exit the world. Right? We're somehow, even though, again, if you pulled a bunch of people who've had a baby come out of their body, I'm sure we could come up with lots of ideas about how we would rather it go down, right? Mine involves, like, I don't know, grapes being brought to me, a light fan, maybe a foot massage. The thing is, no one's asking. This is not about preference, right? We don't have to like it. It is what is required for birth and life to come into the world, right? And so our bodies, again, like in childbirth, we trust, not fun. No one likes it. I don't want to sign up for it again. Did it once, done. right? But I was capable of metabolizing the pain that was required for that experience to occur. And so we have to trust that we're able to metabolize the pain required for life and our loved ones to exit the world.
Okay, so we are going to start with some grief myths. So as you can see, Rochelle covered a lot of what we know about grief. So we're going to go into a little bit more detail to some of those things that she had mentioned. So we're going to start by kind of debunking a few of these grief myths first, and then we're going to go into more detail with some of these. So these are some of the myths that we hear most commonly, or we see amongst a lot of our clients and families. And they're not entirely true, okay? So the first one is that grief is only the feelings that you have when someone you love has died. So Rochelle just talked about this a little bit more too. There's so much more than just those feelings that we experience. We experience it in our whole bodies. Anger should not be a part of grief. We often think that of grief of being sad and tears, but again, it's so much more than just sadness, including anger. Grief begins after a loved one has died. So we also know that grief can begin way before someone has died. And it also lasts a lot longer than just after that death. So sometimes grief starts when someone may have a life-limiting illness, and we're starting to see some of those changes. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this in a little bit. After about 12 months experiencing all the first, you should be over your loss. So we know that grief lasts much longer than 12 months. It's lifelong, actually. And again, we're going to talk a little bit more about some of those questions about how long should grief last, and that intensity piece. Once grief is resolved, it never comes up again. Also, not so true. It never really leaves. We don't really resolve it. It's something we learn to live with, and we actually learn to kind of integrate it into our lives. And we also kind of re-grieve in different phases. And we're going to talk much more about this in our second webinar, because especially with children, they go through different phases developmentally, and they re-grieve kind of the most. So grief ends a relationship that you had to your person. We often actually say that grief ends a life, not a relationship. We actually learn to have a new relationship with this person. It changes after someone dies. And there's something that we call continuing bonds theory that we're going to talk about in a few weeks. And it talks about how it's actually really healthy and important to remain in a relationship with the person that has died. Grief is a mental illness. It's not a mental illness. It's not a disorder. It's not something that we often diagnose. There can be complications with grief, which we will also talk about on another slide. But most typically, we don't really refer to grief as an illness or something that's symptoms, more responses and reactions that we experience naturally, as Rochelle spoke about too. It's a very natural part of our life. If you had a complicated relationship with the person that died, your grief should be easier because you weren't that close. Often not true either. So there's so many different factors that influence our grief. Our relationship is one of them. And sometimes there can be lots of myths or expectations about how we should grieve and how easy or difficult we experience grief. And this sometimes also falls under something called disenfranchised grief. So we're going to talk some more about that too. And lastly, to protect children from negative experiences, we should keep them away from the bedside and shield them from death, dying, and grief. So of course, we're going to talk all about children's grief and how we can be supporting children and including them in talks around grief and death and dying. We actually want to incorporate and include children as much as we can. And so this is what this webinar series is all going to be about. So we really love this diagram. We use it a lot. We took it from Andrea Warnick. So on the left, the picture says stages of grief. So we often think about expectations and phases of grief that we should experience. And what we really know to be true about that, though, is there are typical experiences and typical feelings and experiences and stages that we all go through, but not in any particular order. So grief is not linear. There is no timeline. So often what our experience, or all the time, our experience more so looks like the picture on the right. So we feel all different feelings, experiences. We have outbursts. We may experience shock, numbness, but then also hope and happiness all over the place. And this changes sometimes minute to minute, day to day, and over our whole lives. As you said, we experience grief throughout our whole lives. And so this changes all the time, and it's not as concrete or to be expected as what we all wish that sometimes maybe it would be, so that we would have a bit more control over that. But grief is something that we actually can't predict or expect to know what we are going to experience. So just another kind of myth of those stages of grief, and more so what the realistic experience of grief is. So we're going to talk a little bit more about, so what is grief? And Orly's going to continue on and tell us a little bit more about what we can kind of expect or not expect when it comes to grief.
Absolutely. And I mean, really the slide is summarizing, I think, a lot of what we saw in that video. We talk about what is grief. I think even as adults, grief is a very big experience. Like with kids, we would talk about big feelings and big experiences. And so it can be hard to put grief into words. But really, I think when we pare it down, grief is a response to loss or a response to change. We at the hospice talk mostly about death-related loss, but absolutely you would grieve after any kind of loss or big change in your life. And that response can contain all different kinds of experiences. So it might be thoughts, behaviors, emotions, as well as physiological changes, which we don't often talk about. Like Rochelle said, grief is way more than just a feeling. It impacts us on every level of our beings, right? Again, grief is permanent. We would hope and expect that it evolves and changes over time. So certainly, if you are a newly bereaved person and you're within kind of the first few months of death, what we would hope would be that your experiences would change over time and not be the same experience you're having right now in this moment. But we like to say that if the loss is permanent, then so too is the grief, right? It's not something that we get over, or we resolve, or we wake up one day and then it's gone kind of thing. It's something that's with us always. But we do hope that as we integrate the loss into our lives, that our experience would change. Grief is necessary. It is one of the most natural things for human beings to do. It is a necessary and natural part of the human life cycle. Again, we've talked about this. It's not mental illness. It's not weakness. It's not a personality flaw or a punishment. Grief is one of the prices of admission to being a human being that we talk about. Grief is a holistic experience, not just a feeling. We've talked about that already. I've heard this saying a lot. It's a process. It's not an event. That's when we talk about grief work, and it is work. Like it's work to process the loss and to go through all of those experiences and to allow ourselves to feel them. And so it's not just, it's not a passive experience. Like when we think of a person who's in labor, right? It's a very intense experience, and they have to be actively engaged. And it takes a lot of work to process or metabolize that experience. And so too does it take a lot of energy and work to process when someone has died or when we are grieving. It's interesting because grief, I think, is so deeply a unique experience, and yet it is a collective or shared experience. One of the things that I tell children when I work with them is that every single human being on earth, 100% of human beings at some point will experience grief in their lives. And so it's something that we all experience, and a very, normal human part of life. But it is also very deeply unique, right? Everybody experiences it differently, depending on a variety of factors that we'll talk about, depending on your social location, your personality, your past experiences. And so it's this interesting balance of we all experience it, but it is also deeply unique. These are just a few definitions So grief, we would say, is the constellation of all of those internal experiences or those internal responses. So our thoughts, our feelings, those behaviors, that kind of thing, when we lose someone or something. So grief is not death specific. We experience grief when we lose a job. We experience grief perhaps after a divorce. There's, you know, obviously in those situations, no one has died, but we still experience grief because there's been a big change. Mourning, so grief, if we think of all those internal experiences that we have or those internal responses that we have, mourning is when we actively experience or express, we take our grief and experience it or express it outside of ourselves. So examples of mourning, I mean, could even just be talking about the person who has died. Funerals, rituals are all different examples of what we would do with mourning. I mean, we'll talk in week 4 or 5. No, in week 3, actually, when we talk about mourning and continuing bonds and kind of maintaining a relationship with the person who's died, we'll talk a lot more about what mourning is. But we're thinking of when we take those kind of internal experiences and express them outwardly. That's the act of mourning. Bereavement refers to the period of time of grief and mourning after the death of a person. So again, I said that grief is not death specific. Bereavement means a death has occurred. So if I have experienced, I may have experienced grief, but not actually be a bereaved person. And if I've experienced a death, then I am a bereaved person. And anticipatory grief, Kayla brought this up in that myth busting slide, but anticipatory grief is the grief that we experience before someone dies or before a loss happens. And we're experiencing the anticipation of pain or of grief based on the changes that are happening before a loved one dies. So when we think about people who have a life-limiting illness, there are a lot of, it is not just the death at the end of the illness that the person themselves experience or their family. It is all of those losses that happen along the way. You know, losses in function, maybe the person isn't able to walk anymore. And there are just so many moments and so much grief that actually happens before the person even dies. And so again, it kind of relates back to that myth of grief only happens after someone you love has died, when we know it's not that way. So then we'll talk a little bit about the effects of grief. I think it's just mostly what you need to know about this slide is that it affects us on more than just an emotional level. So there absolutely are those emotional responses or emotional effects of grief or emotional reactions, but we also talk about social responses. So for example, if I am a bereaved spouse and my partner has died, how do I relate to our couple's friends, for example? My role in my social group may have changed. It also, depending on the roles that you take up in your relationships with the person that died, perhaps you were always or your person rather was always the person who drove if you were ever going somewhere, or perhaps they were always the one who did the groceries maybe. Now the person who is left behind is having to take up those different social roles, and that's absolutely a form of grief, but we don't really talk about it too much. We absolutely grieve spiritually. This can be regardless of if you have religious or spiritual beliefs before your loss happens. Really, like Rochelle said, it's about how we make meaning of our experiences, and absolutely that changes and is impacted when someone we love has died or when we are grieving. There are cognitive or intellectual responses, you know, ruminating, like not being able to kind of stop thinking about maybe certain aspects about the death. Lots of people who come to the hospice talk about being in the grief fog, especially in the beginning, right after the loss has occurred, saying things like, you know I went to the funeral, but I can't tell you how I got there. I don't know what I ate for breakfast that morning. I can't tell you what I wore or who I talked to. It's just gone. It's not. And that's very, very, very normal and very common, a very common experience after when you're grieving. And then the other, I would say, is we don't talk about the physical or those physical responses that people have. Absolutely, grief impacts us physically. There's research to suggest that there are those physiological changes that take place within us. It's not just an emotion. So things like feeling really tired, maybe there's changes in appetite. Some people talk about really like heavily sighing a lot or needing to take lots of deep breaths. There's lots of physical reactions that happen when we're grieving.
So as we have all mentioned today, our grief is so unique to us and who we are. And there are so many factors that influence our grief and how we experience grief. So the intensity of grief and a person's response to loss vary so greatly. And we're going to touch on some of those factors that have an influence. And there's probably so many more that we may not even mention today. So just knowing that your grief is as unique as you are, and that will change over time too. So our personality, the personality of the person that is grieving. So who you are as a person, your temperament, your self-esteem levels, the way that you cope with things or stressors or challenges, those will have a big impact on how you also respond to grief and what you do with your grief. We also talk a lot about with kids too is their resiliency, or if they're more of an extrovert or an introvert. So really being able to assess and know our child best will help us understand a little bit more maybe about how they may respond to grief as well. The degree of attachment to the deceased person. So we're going to talk also about attachment bonds. So this is referring to how much you maybe relied on a person, or how close of the degree of attachment was to this person, maybe how involved they are in your life. And this, especially with children, we have such a strong attachment to, our immediate family members or those that are very close to us. So this can definitely impact how we grieve. The nature of that relationship. Ambivalence can cause intense or extensive feelings of guilt or anger. Those are just some to mention, but all depending on your relationship with that person, that may have an impact, and it's not always what we expect either. So the circumstances of death, often if it is sudden or unexpected, this can really throw us for a loop. We're caring about our day-to-day. Maybe we had our life kind of planned out, and then all of a sudden, this huge loss and change happens in our life that we had no time to prepare for. So we hear that a lot, that those sometimes can be sudden or unexpected deaths, can be really, can have a major influence. However, that's not to say that ones that aren't sudden and that we are expecting, if it's a long illness, if we did have a chance to say goodbye, those very much so could still be just as intense or really have such an impact on our grief too. So sometimes when we are preparing for a death though, maybe we're more involved or have more exposure at the end of life, and can really spend more time with someone. So we've had a chance to, fully say goodbye and spend some extra time and have more memories with this person. These all just influence on, these influence our grief and influence how we respond in that acute grief. So right after someone has died, and even long-term too. So previous experiences with death. So, maybe the person that has died in your life right now is the first significant loss that you've had in your life. Maybe it's the first family member or someone that's been really close to you. Or maybe you have had multiple losses. That brings us into that next factor. This will all have an impact as well. And when there are multiple losses, say within a short period of time, sometimes we call this compounded grief. So we're grieving so much loss and so much change, and it's hard to really focus or really even process each of those changes in our lives, and truly starting that grieving process for each person. So our experiences with death and how we have coped with that grief in the past. Sometimes we have patterns in how we respond to grief too. So other stressors in your life right now, maybe you were working and now all of a sudden you're not able to work because maybe you're caring for your children. If it's a spouse that has died, maybe you're a single parent now, and that's completely changed your world around you as well. Other stressors may include, maybe you lost a job, or maybe there's other financial stressors in your life, maybe other family or friends are having challenges in their life. So when there's all those different layers or things added to the stress in your life right now, that can make it really hard to grieve as well, and to have that time too sometimes to process. The availability of support networks and your willingness to access support. We know that this is one of the biggest factors of how we're able to grieve is, do we have that social support from friends, family? Are we willing to seek professional support? We know that it's so hard to grieve entirely on our own, to face grief as one of these biggest challenges in life all by ourselves is near impossible. And the support network that we have around us and the support that we're willing to get can have such a great influence on helping ourselves and our families and our kids cope with that grief too. So. And family environment. So this may include maybe if you're an adult, maybe your upbringing and your exposure and openness to talking about grief and death and dying. Maybe your family is really open and you guys talk a lot about challenges in life, and you talk about your experiences of grief, and you're more open to talking about death and dying. For some families, you don't really go there, right? Even if you've had maybe losses in your upbringing or in your, with your family, maybe it's just not talked about, right? So that will all impact how how you experience grief too. And as well as the availability of your family environment, right? If you see them as a strong support in your life, and maybe they're not as present, maybe because they're struggling with their grief or because of other stressors, that will really have an impact on your family environment and how you're able to share that experience with your family or in your home. And role modeling of grieving. So we're going to talk much more about role modeling and supporting our children and what that means. And, there's not really a good grief or a bad grief, but we're going to talk lots about ways that we grieve and ways that we can support our children in grieving too in the next coming weeks. So this is a really common question that we hear too, is how long will it take? How long am I going to grieve for? How long am I going to feel like this for? And really the most appropriate answer is as long as it takes. There is no timeline on that we're able to tell you that you're going to experience what your experience is what you're experiencing, because we know that it changes and evolves all the time. Like Orly said, we hope that your grief will change over time. We'll learn to integrate and cope with our grief as time goes on. We often hear that a common belief is that after about 1 year of holidays and that first birthday and that first death anniversary, that that I should be over it and that I should be in a better place. But that isn't always the case. Sometimes that first year can be the toughest year. Some people say that second year is the toughest year, and sometimes it's 10 years down the road and that's your toughest year because you're going or you're experiencing different milestones or part of your life that maybe you had hopes and dreams and goals to have with someone that has died. So like we said, it changes, and it all kind of depends on how we choose to alter or have this relationship with this person in our life. So how present they remain, and how much we choose to, bring them into this new normal of our life. So when we're grieving, we are forever changed, and that changes us as a person. And so there's no timeline to what you're going to experience and how you're going to experience that, and it's different for everyone. So next I want to talk to you guys a little bit about different grieving styles. So I'm going to start by saying though, even though we're going to talk about grieving styles, no one there's no right or wrong way to grieve, and it's likely that there'll be a combination of how you grieve. There often are patterns and styles of the way that we grieve, and we sometimes, depending on our personality, and again, some of those factors, we tend to grieve more intuitively, which is with our heart and our spirit, or more instrumentally with our mind and our body. But that's not to say that for many people, it's a bit of a combination, okay? So Martin and Doka talk about two more distinct types of grieving styles. So when someone more so experiences their grief and navigates their grief with their heart and spirit, this may mean that maybe they have more tears, maybe they express their grief more emotionally, or they are more emotional. Often, again, we will think of that as sadness or despair. And often these feelings may kind of dominate what we're able to like think and do and how we behave. And we may experience more intense grief bursts if you're an intuitive griever. And grief bursts are more so those emotional experiences that kind of come out of nowhere. They're not always emotional, but when we're talking about our intuitive griever, we may experience those emotional bursts of, being in the grocery store, and then next thing we know, we're just bawling and we're sobbing and we didn't expect it. So this is when we're feeling it more with our heart and spirit, and we're allowing it to experience it more emotionally or with our heart and spirit. And then our instrumental, more grieving style or individuals is when we experience grief more physically. So maybe we are more of those doers, and we kind of act on what we're experiencing, and we express our grief and we mourn by doing things. So maybe it's planning of that funeral. Maybe we're setting up, a GoFundMe page to help support that family or your family. Maybe you're taking care of all those plans after someone has died, taking care of the body, doing all of that paperwork, and that's what helps you grieve, and that's what helps you give you a little bit more of that control. And that's a way that you're also able to make more sense of what you're experiencing, is kind of putting that into action. And sometimes that also can mean more of that problem solving. So like we said, there is no right or wrong way to do this though, but we sometimes will notice that we fall into one of these categories. We also wanted to mention that when we're talking about grief, there are also a lot of expectations that are put on us, either by our friends, our family, society. We don't talk about grief a lot in our day-to-day or with strangers. And so often we kind of fall into how or we're placed into these boxes about how we should be grieving or what we should be experiencing. So like Rochelle said, don't cry too much, because and then we'll think that there's a concern, or we'll be really worried about you, but you can cry a little bit. Or if you're sometimes a female, you're more expected or perceived to be okay to be more emotional or to cry more, whereas sometimes there's this more belief that if you're a male, you should be crying more and you should be taking care of your family and stepping up. But that's not the case. We're all so unique and we experience grief so differently, that there is no right or wrong way that we should be experiencing that. But just knowing that sometimes there may be a little bit more of that pressure, and just knowing that whatever way that you are grieving and experiencing your grief, it's okay and it's normal and it's supposed to be a natural response.
So we'll talk a little bit about a specific type of grief. So we did talk about kind of a few definitions more towards the beginning of this presentation, but there is a kind of grief that is important to talk about when, especially as we move forward and talk about children's grief, and that is the idea of disenfranchised grief. It's a bit of a mouthful. So disenfranchised grief usually refers to a loss that's not socially sanctioned, it's not acknowledged, or publicly mourned. So it's kind of this idea of grief with nowhere to go. We don't have anywhere to put it. There are multiple contexts in which grief may be disenfranchised. So perhaps if the relationship is not recognized, so the relationship that you, the griever, had with the person. We see this a lot with kids with maybe great-grandparents or grandparents if they weren't maybe in the same city. We kind of perceive that that's not that's not the same as losing, you know, a sibling or a parent. And so we don't really have as much space or maybe compassion for those people. There's also, you know, that idea of, well, the person was older anyways and they lived a good life. And so grief like that can become disenfranchised. Perhaps also the loss is not recognized. We see this a lot with miscarriage, stillbirth, infertility. If we don't really recognize those as losses, then the griever has nowhere to put that grief, has nowhere to put it. The griever may not be recognized. So often, the reason why it's really important for us to talk about this when we're talking about grieving children and youth is that grieving children, especially younger children, are often not recognized as legitimate grievers. And so unfortunately, their grief can often become disenfranchised. And not that any of the adults in their life are meaning to do this. I think what happens is that children present their grief very differently than we as adults do. And when their grief doesn't look the way that ours does, and we kind of expect that it will, then we assume, okay, the children are fine. And what we know is it's just that they grieve really differently. And so we just don't pick up on it in the same way because we're expecting them to grieve in the same way that we do. And so unfortunately, the child, that is not recognized as a griever. Also, elderly people are often not really recognized as grievers. And if the death is stigmatized, sorry, if the death or loss is stigmatized, and then also the ways that individuals grieve. So we'll talk, I think on the next slide, we'll kind of go through some examples of what disenfranchised loss, some more examples rather of disenfranchised loss or disenfranchised grief. It's important to remember, so we talked about young grievers not being recognized as more legitimate. They often in literature refer to young children as the forgotten mourners. It's just something to keep in mind. So just some examples of disenfranchised loss. The death of a pet with children is huge. I mean, I think it's also huge. It's not really something that we make a lot of space for in society in general for everybody, but for kids, really, really important, especially if we think about how attached they are. It's a member of the family, you know, and it is a missing person or a missing member of the family that the child is coming home to all of the time. It's absolutely legitimate, but we don't think of it in the same way. If the death, when we're talking about those stigmatized deaths, perhaps if the death is by suicide, homicide, overdose, perhaps HIV or AIDS, potentially, you know, if the person was in a drunk driving accident and was impaired, those are also stigmatized losses. Abortion, miscarriage, stillbirth, SIDS, infertility, adoption, we talked about that. This is more disenfranchised grief, kind of in that anticipatory grief section. So perhaps the person is still alive, but they've changed. And so we're grieving that loss. So we might see this with if someone has a traumatic brain injury, if they have Alzheimer's or dementia, if there's mental illness or substance use, with terminal illness as somebody, or life-limiting illness as somebody kind of progresses towards death. They are still alive, but they're very different than they used to be. Perhaps the death of an ex-partner, same-sex partner, especially if you were not out to your family or they were not out to their family, an extramarital affair, or loss of relationship from divorce. We don't make a lot of room for that type of grief in society. The loss of home, perhaps even like the loss of hopes and dreams, our health, our lifestyle, language, culture, and traditions. And then we also talked about this being a griever who is young, elderly, or unrecognized.
Okay, thanks, Lori. So we are just about to wrap up our session for today. Before we do that, I want to read to you guys a poem called The Waves of Grief. And so this is written by an individual off of Reddit, actually, so more of a blog online. But we think that it's a really beautiful way to encompass those experiences of grief. So feel free to follow along, or you can close your eyes or just sit back and listen. And I'm going to read it to you guys. Okay, so Waves of Grief. I'm old. What that means is that I have survived so far, and a lot of people I've known and loved did not. I have lost friends, best friends, acquaintances, coworkers, grandparents, mom, relatives, teachers, mentors, students, neighbors, and a host of other folks. I have no children, and I can't imagine the pain it must be to lose a child. But here's my 2 cents. I wish I could say you get used to people dying. I never did. I don't want to. It tears a hole through me whenever somebody I love dies, no matter the circumstances. But I don't want it to not matter. I want it to be something that just passes. My scars are a testament to the love and the relationship that I had for and with that person. And if the scar is deep, so was the love. So be it. Scars are a testament to life. Scars are a testament that I can love deeply and live deeply and be cut or even gouged, and then I can heal and continue to live and continue to love. And the scar tissue is stronger than the original flesh ever was. Scars are a testament to life. Scars are only ugly to people who can't see them. Or can't see, sorry. As for grief, you'll find it comes in waves. When the ship is first wrecked, you're drowning with wreckage all around you. Everything is floating. Everything around you reminds you of the beauty and the magnificence of the ship that was and is no more. And all you can do is float. You find some piece of wreckage and you hang on for a while. Maybe it's some physical thing. Maybe it's a happy memory or a photograph. Maybe it's a person who is also floating. For a while, all you can do is float. Stay alive. In the beginning, the waves are 100 feet tall and crash over you without mercy. They come 10 seconds apart and don't even give you time to catch your breath. All you can do is hang on and float. After a while, maybe weeks, maybe months, you'll find the waves are still 100 feet tall, but they come further apart. When they come, they still crash all over you and wipe you out. But in between, you can breathe, you can function. You never know what's going to trigger the grief. It might be a song, a picture, a street intersection, the smell of a cup of coffee. It can be just about anything, and the wave comes crashing. But in between waves, there is life. Somewhere down the line, and it's different for everybody, you find that waves are only 80 feet tall or 50 feet tall. And while they still come, they come further apart. You can see them coming, an anniversary, a birthday, or Christmas, or landing at O'Hare. You can see it coming for the most part and prepare yourself. And when it washes over you, you know that somehow you will again come out of the other side. Soaking wet, sputtering, still hanging on to some tiny piece of the wreckage, but you will come out. Take it from an old guy. The waves never stop coming, and somehow you don't really want them to, but you learn that you'll survive them. And other waves will come, and you'll survive them too. If you're lucky, you'll have lots of scars from lots of loves and lots of shipwrecks. So we hope that perhaps by listening to that poem, and we can provide you with a handout of it, maybe you'll come back to it. We hope that it can maybe offer you a little bit of maybe validation and reassurance of where you're at and what you're experiencing, and maybe a little bit of hope and comfort to know that maybe those intense 100 feet tall waves right now are really wiping you off your feet and you're just surviving, and that's okay. But over time and eventually those waves will become smaller. You will be able to handle them a little bit more, and you will again come out of those waves. And those waves and those shipwrecks will be a testament of your love with your loved ones. So,
absolutely. Yeah. I think it's great because it also kind of normalizes that those waves, they always come, right? It's not realistic for us to expect that one day it'll just be calm waters forever, right? And that it's normal, right, for those waves to still come 10, 20, 30 years down the road. Yeah, grief is permanent. So we're going to end today. We're hoping to end each webinar series with like this kind of teachable moments, which is like, how do we take what we've learned today and kind of apply it? Because we're doing this online and it's a recording, perhaps you are watching this and your child is attending a group with us. and maybe not, and that's okay. So ways that you can kind of continue this grief work outside of a group with your child. It might be you have a conversation if your child isn't attending group with us right now, about what you learned at group this week. And if your child is attending group, then you can ask them about what they learned. And if it's possible, all we really want to do right now is just kind of set up a little bit of a routine where you talk with your child about what you and or they did at group this week. So it might be if they're not attending group yet, you just seriously say, I'm watching a school video series and this is what I learned today. And I'm wondering if maybe like every time I watch a video, we can have a conversation. I can tell you about what I learned. For some, it's, talking in the car ride on the way home from group if your kid is attending. Whatever works for you, you need to find something that works for you and your child. And so this kind of routine is going to help us further down the road as we have other teachable moments and ways you can talk with your child about what we're talking about in this webinar. And kind of continue those themes, I guess, if that makes sense. So for example, you might ask them what they liked about group, what they learned. You might share what you liked about today's group, what you learned. And then over the next 5 sessions, we'll be we're hoping to build on this topic of teachable moments with, suggested maybe activities, resources to check out, and so on. So we have our references up here if anybody's interested in that. Thank you very much for joining us today. I hope that this has been a good kind of jumping off point and getting our feet wet talking about Grief 101 and what grief is, and that it's helpful to you. And like I said, this is session 1 of 5. And so next time we will be discussing Children's Grief 101. So kind of taking what we've learned today about grief in general and now applying it to children and youth, because what we know is that it's very different, the experience of grief for children and youth versus adults. So stick with us. If you have any questions, the email address is at the beginning of our presentation and should be on your slides. And if you want to request more materials or have any conversations with us, we always welcome that. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, and we will see you next time.